So hello, everyone. I think we can get started. If all speakers are okay with that, we got the thumbs up from the TPI team. We have TPI's Executive Director, Mr. Sami Atalla, Dr. Sami Atalla, he's here with us. Please, Dr. Sami, if you'd like to say a word, please feel free to come in before I get started. I don't know if Sami hears me.
Hi, yes, hi, Farah. Thank you so much. And I'm really obviously interested in this panel, and I signed up as a actually attendee rather than a speaker, but thank you so much for giving me the floor. I just think best in really 30 seconds. First of all, just to value the partnership with ARI on working on the pandemics and the impact of the pandemics, which has opened up a lot of issues for us in Lebanon and in the region. And one of these themes is today's workshop or panel or webinar on the gig economy, which is something that we're actually working on and plan to work on in the future. So I'm really excited to hear what the panelists have to say so we can build on this and move forward for an agenda in the Arab world. So over to you, Farah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sami. So yes, let's get started. My name is Farah Al Shami. I'm a research fellow at the Arab Reform Initiative. I'm going to begin by giving the audience a few housekeeping information. So we're going to all be speaking in English, all speakers, and myself as the moderator, and I am pleased to be moderating today's session. We'll be speaking in English, but there is interpretation from English to Arabic that is available. Just for those who just feel more comfortable listening in Arabic, please feel free to join the Arabic interpretation channel. Otherwise, just keep your interpretation off and you'll hear us speak in English. The other point is for all participants to kindly keep muted unless they ask for like to say your words in the chat box or by using the raise hand feature. And if you have any questions, this is meant to be an interactive discussion. If you have any question, please also leave that in the Q&A chat box, and I'll make sure to convey them to the speakers, and we'll make sure to address them during the roundtable discussion. Thank you, everyone, for finding the time to join us today. This is our 8th webinar in the series of webinars of the Arab Region Hub for Social Protection, which is titled Social Protection After Social Distancing. As Dr. Atalla has mentioned earlier in his note, the Arab Region Hub for Social Protection is a consortium of 4 think tanks, national think tanks, and 3 independent media outlets, including the Policy Initiative as a national think tank operating in Lebanon, and including Daraj Media for Lebanon, Mada Masr for Egypt, EIPR for Egypt, among others. This consortium is led by the Arab Reform Initiative, and we are happy to be partnering together to convene this webinar, which falls, within the umbrella of a very timely and necessary topic to be addressed. The Arab Region Hub for Social Protection started first in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and started during COVID, but it's now looking on ways to expand social protection to vulnerable groups through legal, institutional, and policy reforms. It's looking at the political economy of our social protection systems, and it's also looking on ways to finance the universal social protection systems that we are aiming for and that we advocate for, and to try to mobilize these social movements on social protection demands by equipping them with the needed knowledge, awareness raising, knowledge regarding concepts of social protection, but also with the activism tools and tactics, and with the needed set of evidence-based policy recommendations. Now, today's webinar is entitled Precarious Work or No Work, the Predicament of Joining the Platform Economy in the Arab Region. And this is indeed a predicament to be nuanced and a predicament to be addressed. It's not only related to the platform economy, but to the gig economy more broadly, which is both, which could take 2 forms. It could be digital and it could be offline. But the online or the platform version of the gig economy is the one that is manifesting in a more acute manner on the workers, and that can be really associated with precarious work conditions. So just to give some key introductions related to gig work. Gig work is demand-based employment. It's on an on-demand basis. And it has been proven to be a form of precarious work because gig workers tend to be on zero-hour contracts or temporary freelance contracts. They earn income only when they work, and they work exclusively when there is demand on their employers' goods and services. This obviously makes them very prone to economic shocks, including ones like the COVID-19 pandemic, the repercussions of the Russia war on Ukraine, among others, which make this demand on the goods and services very volatile and very uncertain. As independent contractors, gig workers are also deprived from the rights and the benefits stipulated under the common terms for permanent formal jobs. They typically do not benefit from Social Security coverage, or in rare cases, when they are given the choice to enroll in Social Security, in a Social Security fund, for example, by their employers, they are most likely to opt out, as their contribution, because I mean, most social protection programs are contributory in the Arab region, and these workers cannot really afford those contributions because they take a big share out of their aggregate compensations. Gig workers do not also have the right to unionize, despite unfair power dynamics with their companies and being subject to high risks of layoffs, to reduced wages, to reduced hours of work, especially amid crises. They cannot exercise collective action, and they cannot bargain in order to balance out the dynamics that the unfair dynamics that they are enduring, and to voice out their demands and grievances. Gig work would be also considered, would only be considered actually decent work if it was accompanied by a solid legal framework that actually protects the workers' rights. However, Arab countries are known to suffer from loose labor codes that are full of loopholes and that do not take this emerging labor market into account. Even the labor rights that are stipulated in the existing laws are neither sufficient nor enforced due to weak rule of law. In addition, the last 3 years have witnessed an enlargement in the gig economy all over the world, as the economies have become more digitalized, and the pandemic was also coupled with a rise in the digital economy and in remote work at the same time. So this recent development has made the gig economy in the form of, that is taking the form of platform or digital work, platform economy, has made it even more prominent and more common. And this recent development requires particular attention from our end as researchers and human rights advocates, and implies the need to carefully account for key e-economy and e-commerce parameters when advancing any legal reforms related to gig labor. Now, to know more about this issue, we have with us today 3 speakers who have conducted very deep research on the topic, trying in an attempt to provide evidence that gig work is precarious work and lacks the principles of decent work, just like we have evidence from Europe on that already. So let's start with our first speaker for today. Let's start with Dr. Oguz Alyanak, who is a cultural anthropologist whose research spans labor migration, urban studies, religion, and masculinity. Currently, Dr. Alyanak holds a postdoctoral researcher position at the Fair Work Project, researching working conditions in platform work and the gig economy in Germany. He's also a visiting researcher of the Globalization Work and Production Research Group at the WZB Berlin Social Science Center. Dr. Oguz, we'd like you to tell us more about the landscape of the platform economy in the global north, more generally, and how this is different from the particularity of the Arab region per se. We'd like to hear from you about what countries have started integrating inclusive legal frameworks that regulate the platform economy and can serve as best practices. And also, how can we ensure fair working conditions in a sector that is largely unregulated? I know these are questions that are hard to answer, but we trust that you're going to give us a lot of valuable information on this, and the floor is yours. You've got 15 minutes.
Thank you, Farah. I'll share my screen and do a PowerPoint presentation. So as you mentioned, so the way I'm organizing this talk is basically twofold. First, I'm going to try to elucidate a bit what the current situation is, and then I will try to focus a bit more on what can be done. There's a lot of pessimism, of course, with regards to platform work, and we all share that for right reasons, but I would like to keep a bit of an optimistic note as well when it comes to the policy world, but more so the worker activism part of it. So we know that the platform landscape is fast changing. We have seen this quite widely and vastly in COVID-19 times. Crises have led to speculative investments coming in, pouring in, and getting out of the market quite fast, which led to new platforms entering and exiting the market. We've seen changes in business models of a lot of platforms, and we've seen a lot of acquisitions and bankruptcies also. So really, when I was doing the research in Germany, within a year and a half, I've seen many platforms come in and go. I've seen platforms grow and then shrink very fast. So just to give you a couple of examples, when I was there in 2021, at the height of the pandemic, there was this, for example, platform in the grocery delivery sector called Foodpanda, which is a subsidiary of Delivery Hero. They also operate in multiple other global South countries. That came into Germany for about 6-8 months and then left the market. So like that was really interesting to see. And this was also the time where there was a lot of inflation growth of platforms as such. We've seen another platform, a ride-hailing platform, Clever Shuttle, change business model from business to customer to business, basically within the span of a year. Very recently, we've seen Gorillas, which has been the unicorn, of course, the most famed unicorn in Germany back in 2021, has been taken over by Getir, Turkish company Getir. And very recently, we've seen Drop, a logistics delivery platform, basically going bankrupt, and they just filed for bankruptcy actually as of, I think, last week. So platform economy is fast changing. But one thing that seems to stay the same is that platform work and workers are largely misclassified in this economy, no matter where you look at. So, and there are a couple of reasons why that's the case. First, that there's this conception that platform economy is a marketplace where anything goes, and platforms in this economy act as mere agents and mediators. So they don't really take responsibility necessarily for things that a traditional, in the traditional sector market, companies would take responsibility for: workers' rights, contracts, etc. And within this picture, we see platform workers as being, most of the time, not always, but largely defined as independent contractors. While this was not so much the case in Germany, we had a lot of these platforms actually provide work contracts to their workers. But in Europe at large, and in North America, of course, we see this quite often. And this, of course, brings a lot of precarity for the workers. There are 5 that, as Fair Work researchers, we define and we try to tackle. First one is low payments. Second one is unsafe working conditions. Then there is unfair contracts that are provided to workers, if provided at all, or terms and conditions, which oftentimes include liability exemptions for the platforms. Fourth, there is discrimination and unfair management and algorithmic management, of course. And lastly, we see individualization in this economy and lack of collective representation or collective action. These 5 issues that we have defined in conversation with a lot of different stakeholders over the years as Fair Work researchers, we have implemented as 5 principles of platform work, fair work, in our research. And these are fair pay, fair conditions, fair contracts, fair management, and fair representation, basically correlating the 5 issues that we have just raised. Well, then, so the question that we're asking as Fair Work researchers here is, so, okay, we do the research, we produce the knowledge, but how do we keep platforms to account? We look around and we see in the policy world some changes, of course. In 2021, in the UK and in Netherlands, there were court rulings over Uber drivers being granted employment rights. So this was a big deal in 2021. But we also know in North America, the passing of the Proposition 22 in California led to Uber drivers retain independent contractor status. So 2 conflicting examples from two different parts of the world. In 2021, another big development was Spain's rider law. Now, this was a great deal because for the first time, the freelancers, riders, couriers in Spain were granted employment rights. But was this really, what did it lead to is also another question that we have to ask, because we know after the rider law has passed, Deliveroo has ended their operations in Spain. They basically exited the market. As I was mentioning, they come and go quite fast. It's that kind of economy where platforms can be very mobile. We know Glovo, another big platform that is one of the biggest platforms in Spain and in much of Western and Eastern Europe as well. This employment status was granted to some employers, some employees, some workers, but not others, not all of them. It's still an ongoing debate in Spain, where this is going to lead to within the context of Glovo. And in the case of Uber Eats, another platform, we've seen the platform start using subcontractors or 3PLs. And we see this also happen quite often in many other European countries, including Germany, where, for example, companies, platforms like Uber, FreeNow, which are ride-hailing platforms, do employ subcontractors so that they don't have to be accountable for a lot of the duties, a lot of the responsibilities that they would normally be kept accountable to. And then, of course, finally, we have the EU directive, which has been in conversation for the last year, almost a year. And as of last week, the European Parliament has reached a deal for a draft resolution. But we'll have to wait and see in the national context, how these debates will be taken and what this is going to lead to. And of course, the EU directive is a big step, a supranational step to provide employment status to platform workers. But we will have to wait and see now where it's going to lead to. But, another thing that I'm really enthusiastic about is that worker activism, and I've seen this very closely when I was in Germany, it does matter. In the UK, just to give some examples, we've seen in the last year Uber drivers unionizing. This was one big step, of course, within the context of Uber. We have seen collective bargaining agreements in countries like Austria and France for a lot of grocery and food delivery couriers. So there was collective representation, steps taken forward with regards to that. And of course, in Germany, we've seen pretty much all of the food and grocery delivery platforms, all the major ones, workers getting together and forming works councils, which is the primary step towards collective representation in Germany. So these were not easy steps, but these were definitely positive steps that we have seen. So in the policy world, these are some ways in which platforms can be kept to account. How do we, as then researchers, keep platforms accountable? And this brings me to the second part, which is about the project that we are having right now in Fair Work. And Fair Work basically is an action-oriented research project that situates itself amidst different stakeholders. So platforms, policymakers and government, consumers, and platform workers and organized labor. This is where we're situated when we're looking out and trying to make sense of the platform economy. And it currently takes place in 38 different countries, and it keeps on growing. So there's interest in this research, but there's also things need to be done. And that's what really motivates us, not just the production of knowledge part, but also to create some impact and bring some change to platforms and for the workers. Methods-wise, basically, in each country where this research is conducted, with each different country research team, and we have two of them actually here with us as speakers as well. So I'm very delighted to actually be in this panel with them. We start with desk research and find out and map the platforms in different countries, gather some information about them that's publicly available that we can get our hands on. And then we start with worker interviews and manager interviews to get a sense of what working conditions are like and how it can be improved. And then we bring it all together to produce a report based on that. And more importantly, as I mentioned, we have these 5 principles that address the 5 different distinct issues that we look at in this economy. And each of these issues relate to the principles, and each of these principles are basically assigned a score, 2 points for each principle. And out of 10, we give each platform a score of fairness, basically. And here you can see the research has been going on for the last 3 years. So some countries have been producing reports and scores for the last 3 years. Other countries, Egypt, for example, we're in the 2nd year of research. Actually, before attending this meeting, I was having a meeting with the Egypt research team, finalizing the scores for this year's research. So in Germany, South Africa, and Ecuador, you can see some of the ratings that we have here. And these ratings are all publicly available on the website as well. But more importantly, you know, we're talking about the Arab world. This is what the topic of discussion for today is. Here's Egypt from last year's research, not this year. We're still, as I said, finalizing the scores for this year. Some of these platforms you may have seen, you may have used. This was the league table for Egypt for 2021. And when we look at the overall picture, and I'm going to wrap it up very soon, when we look at the overall picture, in terms of the principles, like, as I said, we have two thresholds for each principle. We have the first point and the second point. The first point, for example, in the context of payment would be minimum wages, that the platform pays at least the minimum wage, local minimum wage, after costs associated with work to their workers. And the second point would be the living wage, which would be, of course, higher in most contexts. And we see that oftentimes platforms may get that first point, but oftentimes fail to get that second point. Within the context of payment, working conditions, and contracts, they may be getting that first point, but as you can see, only half of them, like less than 50%. We're still not talking about the majority getting these points. But when it comes to issues like collective action and representation, we only see 20% of the platforms that we have evaluated, and we have so far looked at 280 of them, rated 208 platforms and accumulated 283 platform ratings. Only 1 out of 5 actually has any mechanism in place, for example, to provide workers with an independent body of collective representation and action. We can get back to these later in the question and answer, of course. And as I mentioned, this is an impact and action-oriented research project. So what matters for us is not just the production of knowledge, but also the impact that we can produce. And here you can see some of the examples of the impact that we have produced, both in terms of our media engagement, academic engagement, but also changes that were implemented by the platforms, our engagement at the policy level. And there are going to be two more things that I'm going to very briefly talk about and wrap it up. First one, as I mentioned, we try to engage with the public and with the policy world at different levels. This was a recent initiative that we have undertaken. During the ILO talks, it was called the Meeting of Experts on Decent Work in the Platform Economy, which took place, if I'm not mistaken, about a month and a half ago. We did have this initiative of a manifesto that we asked researchers around the world to sign, and over 200 of them actually signed it. You can take a look at it on our website. It's still up there if you want to sign it. This was one initiative that was undertaken by us. Another one is one that's continuing on very strongly is the Fair Work Pledge, where we ask institutions you could also bring it to the institutions where you work at, who may actually be making use of platforms, both geographically tethered platforms like delivery workers, etc., but also online platforms like cloud work platforms like coding, transcription, translation, etc., to take a look at the scores that we produce and make conscious decisions based on the scores. So evidence-based, basically change that we're trying to bring here. And the pledge is also on our website. Please do take a look at it. And of course, there are a number of other projects that we engage in. Very recently, we had, for example, a very fascinating graffiti project in Colombia. A year or so ago, we had a billboard campaign in both Germany and the UK, and we try to look for different ways to reach out to the general public, not just the policy and policymakers and the academic world, but also the general public to shape this discussion around platform work and to provide workers with fair working conditions. So this is a big team. It's a huge research project. And here are the most up-to-date names of the research teams in different countries. Some of them may still be missing because always new countries are being added to our research team. But I would like to thank each and every one of them for allowing us to have such an impact and produce good research and to continue on with our endeavor in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oguz. Fascinating research, and we're all, I'm sure everybody is very glad, equally glad, like as I am, to see such efforts. I've been going to produce scientific evidence on this topic that has been really understudied, but that has become so predominant in the economies and Arab economies and the world economies more generally. And it would be good, you just take brought my attention to the fact that we've seen international financial institutions like the World Bank through the IFC investing in platform in applications like Uber and other applications in India and in the global south. But I mean, their investments aren't really being in line with their strategies that they're putting for social justice, for socioeconomic rights and human rights, like the bank's gender strategy and other. So it would be good to see how all of these investments and endeavors could be reframed in a way that make these economic opportunities equitable for everybody, for all the actors in the economic markets. I'm going to turn it now to Dr. Nagla Rizk. Dr. Nagla, I'm going to first start by introducing you. You're a professor of economics and founding director of the Access to Knowledge for Development Center, A2K4D, at the American University in Cairo School of Business. Your research area is the economics of knowledge, technology, and development. And your work focuses on digital technologies and inclusion, zooming in on the governance of data and artificial intelligence, gender, gig work, and inclusive growth in Egypt and in the Middle East, as well as a particular focus on Africa. Dr. Nagla, we'd like you to tell us more about what differentiates workers in the platform economy from those in the informal economy in Egypt. And how does Egypt classify platform or digital-based workers in national labor statistics? What are the implications of this? What are the legal frameworks that regulate Egypt's platform economy? What kind of vulnerabilities does this beget for workers? And the last question that we'd like you to hopefully also address is how can we ensure the integration of fair working conditions in a sector that is largely unregulated, and what can Egypt do to mitigate the risk carried by platform-based workers? The floor is yours, and we're all ears.
Thank you, Farah. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Sami, Wassim, everyone. Thanks to ARI and TPI for the invitation, and to Oguz for giving such a brilliant introduction and segue to my talk. I will try in the next 15 minutes to give you a snapshot of my insights on the topic, as trying as much as possible to respond to Farah's question. And if there are any unresolved issues, we can take further in the Q&A. So again, thank you very much for introducing me and for including me. Allow me then to share my screen, if I just may, slideshow. Okay, so I've also got a brief presentation as I'm marking, but this sort of puts our work in perspective. So, basically, I've concentrated on making 4 points, but I added 0 as I was listening to everyone, because I wanted to take a moment to speak about definitions, because not everyone agrees what gig work is. And I am actually we are the Fair Work team for Egypt, and we work with a very clear definition of platform mediated groundwork, geographically tethered, with the Ubers and the likes. So I would first I will speak about definitions, then I'll talk about the context, I'll talk a bit about our research on the topic, a few points on the legal landscape, and on the way forward. With definitions, I added this actually as I was speaking, because I referred to Tucker's work on the classification of platform-mediated cloud work versus platform-mediated groundwork. And this is very much the latter is what we are looking at when we talk about gig economy. As I say, the Uber and the likes. So basically, because the issues and the challenges are not exactly the same, and then what makes things even more complicated is the comparison of this with informal work, as Farah has kindly asked and noted. So I will speak a bit to that. Then the context. Oguz has given an excellent introduction to what's happening globally and in the global north. But when we take a look at our context, the Arab world, then I've pulled out a few statistics for Egypt. And for obvious reasons, I'm comparing to where we were in 2010. So if you look at a nation with a predominantly young population, we have an announced unemployment of more than 9%, youth unemployment of more than almost a quarter of our youth labor force is unemployed. Almost 1/3 is not in education, employment, or training. So you compare that to 2010, just before the Arab Spring. and there isn't really much difference. Looking at unemployment among those with advanced education, which is very dangerous, so more than 1/5 of those with advanced education are unemployed. And the World Bank cites the number of informal workers in 2020 as 17 million, which is more than 13 million. As a percentage of the labor force, it's actually more. More than 2.5 million jobs were lost in the period in 2020 due to the pandemic. The sectors most affected: retail, tourism, wholesale, manufacturing, construction, and transport. Clearly, the informal workers are the ones that are most likely to lose their work. There is no clear statistic on the gig workers in Egypt, but roughly it's about 500,000 people. That's very rough based on our own research. Also, more than a quarter of Egyptians live on less than 3.2 USD dollar poverty line in 2018, and the rate of poverty, just using the national poverty line, it's almost one quarter of the population in 2010, and now almost approaching 1/3. So we are in a dire economic situation. Given that, what happens is that workers these young youth turn to gig work as an alternative. The sad news is that they think they are moving away from informal work to, the heaven of gig work. They think they are finding livelihoods, and they say that. Started working on Uber in 2017. I have a paper looking at analysis of Uber driver partners in Egypt, and that paper was actually used for what later was called the Ride-Hailing Act, commonly coined as the Uber Act, the legal system in the National Gazette, showing how Uber driver partners, as they call them, make a livelihood out of driving cars. And that's the sad reality, because context matters. If this is the context and there is no work, or the alternative is informal work, this is what they turn to, and they're happy. Now, of course, we all around this table know that there is a lot of challenge there. There's a lot of precarity, and this is what we as Fair Work researchers set out to prove. In 2018, we undertook a study on the women in the ride sharing. It was quite interesting to look at, again, how women look at this as a way for them to find flexible work, way for livelihood, for empowerment. And again, if this is the best alternative, then something must be wrong with the system. In 2020, I did actually a critique of the ride-sharing legislation that cited my own paper, because it was targeted specifically, as I mentioned, it was called the Ride-Hailing Act. Not only that, so it ignored the other gigs, but also startup was beyond the capacity of young startups, let alone what the drivers themselves had to pay to fulfill the requirements of the Act. Then came our wonderful engagement with Fair Work. We have the 2021 studies out. We are currently finishing a 2022 research. And at the same time, forthcoming, and it doesn't show on the slide, but I had it, is also our research, again, in partnership with WZB and GIZ, looking at fair work in the domestic service sector, specifically in the region. Again, we started, as Oguz has presented, our work starts with desk research, mapping the platforms, and doing field work on the ground. In the case of domestic services, it was very challenging, because not only was it placed in other countries, but also we ran into logistical difficulties for running field work, for example, in the Gulf or in other Arab countries. But we managed to do research in Tunisia and in Turkey, and the results were not terribly high. The scores were quite low, actually, and this is still yet to come. Right now, we're working on, within our larger project, which we title New Work in the MENA digital economy. We're actually studying new forms of work, both types that I referred to in the beginning, not just gig work, but also cloud-based work. And we are trying to find data on this, because invisibility in data means invisibility in policymaking. So a good part of this is actually working on data to identify gig workers, so that policy inclusion can take place. And I'm very pleased that we will be partnering with TPI, and actually TPI and with our partners in Jordan are also, not to our surprise, are also Fair Work, Fair Work partners within the larger network. And we're working on changing the definition. You asked me, Farah, about the classification of workers in Egypt, and it's pretty complex. You know, you have four classifications. They're either employees working for others, employers, Egyptians working abroad, and irregular workers, whatever that means. Okay, so gig workers would fall under irregular workers. So it's a big pot of workers that are not formally working, including informal workers, gig workers, and others. So what we are doing right now with the Ministry of with CAPMAS, Central Agency for Public Mobilization and Statistics, is adding questions with people who are working on the labor market panel survey on specifically to identify gig workers in Egypt. And also in a parallel vein, we're working with the Population Council, again with the government, to in their survey of young people in Egypt, asking whether there are people who work in the gig economy, and we specify we define the sector very clearly. I'm just going to move on. This is I think Oguz has shown that. This is the 2021 ratings for Egypt for our platforms last year. This year we are we're working on 10 platforms, 10 startups, and let me just the findings. What we found was again a confirmation of the low pay, lack of protection, but interesting themes came out. First, local startups versus multinationals. And if I remember correctly, this was a similar conclusion to the one in South Africa, that usually the local startups are, especially the management, are relatively more collaborative. They listen to us, they work with us, and it's a win-win scenario because we get to run our research, convince them for our objective to provide better conditions for workers, and this is beneficial to workers and to the platforms as well, as they manage to get better after the provision of scoring, to get better ratings. Also a recurring theme was informality and the comparison to informal work. Again, even in earlier studies, workers would be happy to move from the informal sector, but the sad reality is this is not providing much improvement to the working conditions. Perhaps in the short run, workers may seem, more comfortable that they are working with, and this is quoting, workers with a company that exists, but really in reality, in the longer term, they're not really much better off. In fact, I just marked the student papers, one paper work undertaking, carrying out a comparison, the myth of the myth of gig work being an improvement over informal work, with very interesting primary data and insights. I mentioned invisibility. They are both, at the end of the day, invisible and irregular workers, and definitely that category does not cover everybody. This year, new to field work, we're finding more keenness on vouchers from the interviewees as the economic situation is becoming very difficult. So they're really keen on, being compensated, which is a legitimate part of our research. Female workers, we got to interview female workers because we included domestic service platforms, some of which are very recent. And also we're getting more collaboration from the platforms, again, the local ones. As always, we try to work collaboratively to improve the working conditions for everyone and convince the platforms that we would like them to be model companies rather than be, adversaries. We'd like them to be partners. A word on legal landscape, it's a plethora of legislations. I mean, the labor legislation, taxation, data protection, social insurance, trade unions, traffic, ICT regulated others. So what happens is that there is fragmentation on this sector does not specifically fall under one umbrella of regulator, but also the law moves slower than technology, as everywhere, right? So business models are developing, of platforms, and the technologies are going faster, but the laws are very slow to adapt. But also laws are not nuanced. So the labor law, for example, is homogeneous, treats all labor equally. So are other laws for tech-based startups, for example, which we would like to encourage. And then gig work is not clearly defined and classified. What really matters is, I think the biggest problem, and that's why I put it in red just to be dramatic, is that the way the laws are done is they treat the economy with an old paradigm. It's an economy of competition, markets of competition. There is a worker, an employee, and an employer, rather than the collaborative models that are emerging. So we're no longer looking at a binary, but our legal landscape looks at matters through a binary lens. So what is needed is actually a holistic legislative approach rather than fragmented piecemeal solutions, adapting old laws to solve specific problems at a time where you have evolving business models. We need new thinking for new businesses that harms neither the worker nor the platform owners. We specifically need to encourage local startups because these are the ones that are collaborative, and these are the ones that are actually willing to provide better conditions, fairer work conditions for the worker, and to think of them as model businesses actually for other businesses, not just for gig work, because the context has other problems in the larger economy. Policies managing risks to workers, better definitions, because quite often we find people talking, when they say gig workers, they mean different things. So we need to unify and be very clear about the definitions. And last but not least, better data. Because again, I started with definitions and I end with definitions and data. If people are not visible to data, to the landscape, they're not visible in social protection, they're not visible in market incentives for better growth and for skill development, etc. I will stop there and thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for, these fascinating findings and all of this research, all of these, research efforts and the information and rich data that you've provided. Thanks so much. And I think, three key points that you've raised among so many that I might mention or highlight as takeaways are first, the positionality of the gig economy in the development paradigms. This is one. The importance of the data indeed. And if we are to think about data, probably the digital economy would be better off compared to the offline economy, speaking about gig work, because when we speak about offline gig economy and informal economy, we do not have data at all. At least here we could extract or retrieve some databases from the platforms. So we are at an advantage, but there is still a lot to be done when it comes to that. And the third point is related to the multinationality of those applications and of those platforms. These are mostly multinational corporations. And this means that when we speak about legal frameworks, we need to start thinking about the extraterritorial obligations. And we need to start thinking about how transnational cooperation between countries could happen to be able to enforce the legal frameworks that we need, in a new development paradigm that is digitalized. So thank you so much again, Dr. Rizk. I'm gonna now turn it to my colleague and friend, Mr. Wassim Maktabi. Wassim, I'm gonna introduce you to the audience very briefly as well. You're an economist and a researcher at the Policy Initiative. Your research interests include political economy, public finance, and behavioral economics. And your work at TPI particularly covers Lebanon's financial crisis, progress on reforms, collusion in public procurement, and social protection in the context of the pandemic. Wassim, the floor is yours. I would like you please to address the same questions that were actually addressed by Dr. Rizk, given she spoke about a national case study, not the global or the regional perspective, but while focusing on the Lebanese case, especially you've developed a study on Lebanon within the framework of the Arab Region Hub for Social Protection, and you called those workers the missing middle, rightfully so. So the floor is yours, Wassim.
Thank you so much, Farah. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Oguz and Nagla, for brilliant presentations. You've really made my job easier now to sort of just zoom in on the Lebanese context. But it would be great if you just let me share my screen. And just for some reason.
Yes, sure. Just a second. Wassim. It will take a. Yes, here you go. You can now share it. Otherwise, I'll share it from my end.
That's what. I'm assuming you can see my screen now. You can turn.
Yes, we can see your screen, dear.
Okay, brilliant. So essentially the title in this case says a lot, because as Farah said, there is a predicament that platform-based workers face in Lebanon. So it's either precarious work, in this presentation, I will explain why we call it precarious, or no work whatsoever, meaning they would likely fall in the informal economy, which is particularly invisible to assess the labor conditions. So before I start, let me just mention that we've conducted a study back in late 2021, early 2022, as part of the Arab Hub for Social Protection from COVID, in which we zoom in on the realities of online delivery workers. This study actually pushed us to join the Fair Work Network, which we're now part of, as Oguz mentioned, where we're trying and attempting to monitor and actually push for fair labor regulations in the platform economy. So my presentation today will focus on the study that we conducted back in late 2021 with my colleagues, Sami Zghaib and Carol Abighani. I will structure my presentation based on the questions raised by Farah. The presentation will be divided into three sections. Briefly, first, I will offer a context as to why we're talking about the platform economy in Lebanon. Second, I will zoom in on three particular questions that highlight the vulnerabilities of online delivery workers. And third, I will conclude with some of the key policy recommendations. So why speak of what? Sorry. Okay, so why are we talking about the platform economy in Lebanon, knowing that there is lack of data? Well, simply because its growth can be inferred from two things. First, there is anecdotal evidence as to the increase in the usage of digital labor platforms. So during the pandemic, many of us relied on online delivery services to order basic necessities, to order food, etc. Moreover, there has been an increase in the media coverage as to the vulnerabilities of online delivery workers. The second key feature that allows us to claim that the platform economy is irrelevant in Lebanon is that the labor force is particularly precarious, and this is a result of a deep financial crisis that was triggered in late 2019 that contracted the economy by almost 58%, that pushed unemployment to record highs, estimated at 40% by the World Bank, and the poverty rate at around 80%, with informal employment increasing rapidly. So these are essentially vital ingredients for any precarious work, particularly in the platform economy, to proliferate. So now I will basically zoom in on our study in specific. We adopt a methodology that offers a typology of platform-based work. As Nagla was mentioning, there are different definitions, but for this study, we particularly focus on food delivery services because of two things. First, during the pandemic, they carried large risk of contracting COVID because they had to work in person and not remotely. Second, they were subject to high control by the platform in which they were working for. So briefly to mention the methodology, we selected two digital labor platforms for delivery, namely Torters and Zomato. What we've done is that we've reviewed the legal frameworks that regulate private sector employment and access to social protection. We also reviewed these platforms' terms and conditions. In addition, we conducted interviews with workers via surveys, via structured questionnaires, and we also conducted interviews with experts. So now that we zoom into the particular questions, the first question that I'd like to answer is, to what extent do platform-based workers have access to Lebanon's social protection system? And to answer this question, one needs to look at what determines access to social protection in Lebanon. So the access to social protection is heavily reliant on your employment status. So to answer this question, we zoomed in on the relationship of the worker with the platform and what this relationship means when the state needs to assess the worker's access to social protection. Now, looking at the terms and conditions of platform-based workers, it is clear as day that they are branded as freelancers, as independent workers, and there is no question and no different interpretation when it comes to the work agreement, as you can read them here. So what this means is that platform-based workers as independent workers are excluded from the mandatory social insurance, which is given by the National Social Security Fund, the NSSF, which is the main social insurance provider for private sector workers and that on. However, freelance workers can access a voluntary enrollment in the health insurance scheme, which is not very significant, particularly during the crisis. Now, as to access to social safety nets, it's very important to mention that Lebanon's sort of social assistance landscape relies on proxy means testing and poverty targeting, meaning that these criteria automatically exclude platform-based workers, particularly because the income they generate renders them not poor enough. So they're excluded from the National Poverty Targeting Program. They're excluded from the Emergency Social Safety Net, both of which are financed from the World Bank. So what we see here is, simply put, the diagram that shows platform-based workers have no access whatsoever to the social protection system, rendering making them fall into what is called the missing middle, meaning you are not poor enough to benefit from the social safety nets, and you do not have a traditional private sector employment that gives you social insurance. The second question that I'd like to zoom in on with is, given that platform-based workers do not benefit from social protection, what do platforms do to mitigate this risk on workers? They don't mitigate this risk. The platform-based workers are excluded from what is called fringe benefits or employee benefits provided by the platform. They're excluded from pension schemes, paid leaves, health compensations, particularly during our interviews with workers regarding compensations in cases of injury. It was unclear to work based on the interviews. There was asymmetry of information across the workers, meaning that some workers would think that they would be entitled to such reimbursements in cases of injuries, while others think not. But generally, the agreement is that you get compensated in case of injury only if you're wearing the helmet, driving based on regulations, and during basically delivery of an order. Now, the thing is here is that what I've just mentioned highlight the realities of mainly all freelance workers and no particularities to platform-based workers. So why is this important? Essentially, what makes platform-based workers particularly vulnerable? What we find is that there is a serious case to be made that platform-based workers suffer from a misclassification when it comes to their employment. So when we benchmark their labor responsibilities vis-a-vis the conditions or the requirements that render any employment relationship that of an employee, well, we realize that it is a one-way relationship, meaning that platform-based workers perform the functions of an employee for the platform, but in return, they do not receive their share of employee benefits. The last question, what can be done in face of such dire vulnerability? Well, first of all, Lebanon needs a social protection floor, which would provide core life cycle support across different time stages for individuals from childhood to working age to old age. Second, Lebanon needs to revise the labor code so it is more inclusive to emerging employment statuses. Again, a point raised by Nagla as well. Third, which seems very elusive, but Lebanon needs to regulate or enforce fair labor conditions in the platform economy. And fourth, which is a very important point, the state needs to balance the power asymmetry between the management and the workers, And this is particularly important because as it stands, these workers do not have a systematic way in which they can report claims to their management. Thank you, and I hope I did not take long.
Thank you so much, Wassim. Thank you for this illuminating presentation and much needed research on the Lebanese context. And I mean, I think you also took the discussion to, you added yet a new layer to the discussion, which is what is being done actually, what are the alternatives being done, which are inadequate, especially speaking about social safety nets or poverty alleviation programs, which indeed are very exclusionary, given the methodologies, the targeting methods that they adopt, such as the proxy means testing, which are excluding many. And I mean, social safety nets or social assistance programs do not provide social security. They provide social assistance and not social security at all. So in any case, they would be inadequate and they would be unsustainable, but also not universal. I think we should now open it up for a Q&A, open it up for a discussion with our audience, with our participants. Please feel free to leave your questions in the chat box or just to raise your hand and come in. Otherwise, we could carry on. I mean, we could carry on the discussion among us, just so until we receive any question or any comment from the participants. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, of seconds actually, not minutes. But I'd like to reiterate my thanks to the speakers, I mean, for all of these insightful presentations that not only provide food for thought for a rich discussion now, but also data that we didn't know existed for the Arab region and for the different parts of the globe more broadly. Sami, were you trying to come in? I saw you unmuted yourself for a sec. So I guess not. Probably that was my mistake. So all right. So given that nobody has a question or a comment to ask, I'm gonna. I mean, the essence of our discussion, if we are to somehow synthesize all of these presentations, I think there is this instinct of freedom. Behavioral economists talk about the instinct of freedom at work, particularly. Instinct of freedom exists everywhere, in relationships, in our day-to-day life, but particularly at work, it is there. And especially when we speak about a certain labor market, the workers would like to feel free to make a living and to put bread on the table the way they feel comfortable and the way they think is convenient for them. So restrictions on labor supply that can take different forms, that can take the form of only Lebanese can work. We cannot open it up for refugees to work formally, for example. The ease of doing business, the permits, the again, we're speaking about ease of doing business, opening a shop or opening a corporation, and what does this take for it to be executed? I mean, given the prevailing frameworks, I think all of these are regulations on the labor supply, and I think these regulations are. But I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. The experts with us, I think these are the regulations that are driving the workers away from formality and towards informality. And informality on its own is not bad, but it has to be also regulated. I mean, if we are to speak about the legitimacy of the policy recommendations that we try to advance, it's not our policy recommendations, not those that we discussed today, but in general, the experts, the practitioners trying to speak for the vulnerable groups. We often say that we need to formalize, for example, informal workers, but this is not probably what they actually need. They do not need to be formalized. They rather need a legal framework that can incubate them the way they are and that can provide them with social protection from the perspective of human rights, as a human right, and not from a humanitarian perspective, as a humanitarian aid. So I think there is this trade-off between regulation and protection. I mean, are we gonna regulate to protect, or are we gonna protect to regulate? You know, and I mean, there is a certain threshold. I mean, regulations are very important, if you also agree with me, but beyond a certain threshold, these regulations can start to backfire and can become a slippery slope. And my last point before I mean, give the floor again to Dr. Rizk and to Wassim, I think what is particularly tricky about the gig economy is that it is in the gray zone. I mean, not all not all the industries in the gig economy are fully formal and fully informal, and they are also not fully formal. They are in the middle, and this makes it particularly tricky, especially as in the phase that is in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. The economic recovery has been largely driven by growth of informal labor for the reasons that I've already mentioned, versus vis-a-vis informal labor. So we're seeing all workers going more into this direction, more particularly, especially into the direction of online gig work, because it is being portrayed as more flexible, as an entrepreneurial kind of work. So this is why, I think this discussion was particularly important today. And I'd like now I'm very sorry, I don't recall who raised their hand first, but I know that Dr. Nagla has a commitment. So I'm gonna, if you don't mind, Wassim, I'm gonna give the floor to Dr. Nagla now to probably comment on my comments or add anything that you'd like to add to her very rich presentation. Dr. Nagla, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Farah, and thank you, Wassim, for giving me the word, the mic. You hear me, yeah?
Yes, we hear you now.
Yes.
Your screen is frozen,
okay,
but it's okay.
Sorry about that. I can turn the screen off for a bit. Can you hear me better now? Yes, thank you, Farah, and thank you, Wassim. Well,
I think we lost Dr. Rizk. Philip,
yeah.
No problem. Wassim, please feel free to come in, and then we'll give it to Dr. Nagla, Oguz, and Ola. Please, Wassim.
Okay, sure. I just wanted to add to your comment. I didn't have a particular answer, but I just wanted to solicit the thoughts of Oguz and Nagla. So one thing that gets thrown around is that we as researchers come off as hating on the platform economy or like platforms, while they, okay, Nagla is back. Maybe she can resume.
Yes.
No,
yes.
carry on. لا تفضل وسيم, تفضل, carry on. It's all right. I'll go after you.
Thanks. Okay. Yeah, I was just asking a question actually and not responding. So what I was saying is that what we're doing is not essentially hating on platforms, but one thing that gets thrown around is that we are perceived as doing so. So what I'd like to know from Oguz and Nagla is some platforms or some critics of, let's say, our work generally, or whoever wants to change the landscape of the platform economy, is that it would be actually costly for platforms to integrate these businesses in social security provisions or in employment benefits, etc. Meanwhile, they should actually be praised for their income generation opportunities and their integration to the labor force. I'm wondering, how do we manage such narratives and such trade-offs?
Thank you. May I go, Farah? Thank you, Wassim. Well, I think I'll take the cue from you, and actually the stance of where we stand regarding the gig economy as opposed to what we see in perhaps more developed countries or the global north. We are indeed used to, and maybe I hinted to that in the beginning, what workers themselves say, that this is providing me a living, this allowed me to get married, the women feel stronger. So whenever we talk about this, and I quote Farah's very important word in the introduction, the word nuanced. The situation in our countries is really nuanced. Having said that, it should not be taken to maintain the status quo. So it is a tough balance to maintain. I think in the end, the purpose is to how can we work together to make these platforms model businesses. And the key for us, we find the ray of hope, honestly, in the local startups. We find relatively much more collaboration from local startups, platforms that have been created locally, that start grounds up by relatively younger, well-educated members of the society who try to start something different and listen. They understand research, they work with us, and they actually work with the principles, with fair work principles. So maybe this is one way, if we can really find sort of, you know, the low-hanging fruit, if you will, winners, potential champions who can work with us to improve and get better conditions for work. If I may also make a quick comment about regulation and flexibility, because regulation, as you said something again, Farah, that formalization, the regulation should actually be informed by evidence on the ground, which you know, should the work that everybody around this screen is doing. We're trying to get evidence from the ground to inform regulation, to inform policy making on what is really recommended for the economy, for the people. So again, just thinking top down that we should formalize or that we should create, you know, certain models without listening to what people need, I think this misses a great deal. And anecdotal examples on the ground from research that we do with women on the ground, for example, in informal digital entrepreneurship, and we ask them, would you like to formalize? And they say, no, we don't want to formalize. We would, given the current structure, they would formalize if there is an incentive, an invitation from the market, if there's inclusion. So the same would apply for these platforms if there is collaboration on fulfilling what we would like to see for the workers in a way that does not harm them. And that's the very tough balance to achieve. Last but my final word is on flexibility, because again, flexibility is often touted as the benefit, you know, of this work, and sometimes even for informal work. But sometimes really flexibility warrants a very high price for people working without any benefits, without being included in policies, etc. And again, if I may just put, you know, the gender angle in it, when people say this is good work for women because it's flexible for their care responsibilities, it actually works against them. It becomes the elephant in the room, because in the long term it harms them, because say we're going to corner women in these, you know, jobs. They cannot be in ride sharing, they cannot be in entrepreneurs, they cannot be this and that, because they need actually they can be in ride sharing because they have home care responsibilities. This is not, I mean, flexibility, regulation, all these terms need to be looked at from a nuanced angle, because otherwise they can really severely backfire. I hope this is useful. I will ask to be excused if I may, and thank you ever so much for this. Wonderful to be with you and everyone. Thanks very much.
We thank you, and I thank you on behalf of the TPI team and myself and Ari and the Arab Regional for Social Protection for joining us.
Thank you, and I thank my team at A2K for the, thank you so much. And my team at A2K for the shout out for my team who do a great job doing all of this work together. Thank you.
Congrats, dear. Thank you so much for being with us.
Massive.
مع السلامة. Dr. Oguz and then Ola, please feel free to come in.
All right, I'm going to respond to the questions, but Ola had their hand up earlier. Unless it's, you know, a response to your questions as well, I would be happy to give the floor to them. Otherwise, I'll take the, I'll respond. So when a platform comes and says, you know, you brought up the issue of like, but formalizing it, or from the platform perspective, providing additional protections can be costly. You know, when a platform is getting billions of dollars of investment within the span of less than a year, billions, not millions, with a B, paying a couple of dollars, pounds, euros, whatever currency you want to, is not gonna even put a dent in their pocket. When a platform is getting billions, providing living wage to their workers is not gonna, I mean, this is the usual, of course, you know, the management slash the higher ups slash the investors get the cream on top, the cherry on top, and then the rest just like gets the crumbles. So when a platform is getting billions, it's not going to hurt them to provide better bikes, better gear to their workers, especially given that lack of good gear in this economy leads to a lot of risks, not just, you know, minor risk. We're talking about people who go into coma, workers who die on the streets, or platforms providing channels for workers to reach to management when their payslip is late or missing, or their payment is delayed. Like, these are from a management perspective, getting a couple of days, you're having your payment a couple of days late may not matter as much, but when you're making living day to day, making do day to day, then I've met with colleagues in Germany who, like, having those couple of hundreds, 10, sometimes dozens of euros missing meant they were not going to be able to pay the rent. And that's number one. So I take, like, when I get that, like, I say, no, I'm never going to be able to agree with, you know, any kind of argument on that. Second, we often think of, I think, since we're like making a kind of a comparison between global North versus South, let's not play the trope that working conditions in South, especially in this economy, is abysmal compared to North. Working conditions in global North is also quite abysmal in the platform economy. A lot of that, that's one of our findings, like many of our findings in Fair Work research, that things like when it comes to bad working conditions across different country contexts, they are similar. When it comes to payment issues, I mean, I've shown you that those graphs of how many, only half of the platforms that we evaluated were even able to pay minimum wage, and maybe like 1/3 or 1/4 were able to pay living wage, for example, to give you one example. And in global North, another big problem, and this is why formalizing it matters, is a lot of these workers are immigrants. We often forget that, and a lot of them don't speak the languages in which in the countries they work at. And platform work becomes one of the only means for them to work. When you don't, and platform work only becomes the only means when you're not allowed to get government sponsorship or support, for example, upon arrival. So there is, when it comes to safety net and social security benefits, there is a discrepancy between the citizens versus the immigrants. And that becomes a big deal when it comes to not just that, but also worker organizing. To what extent can workers actually be out on the streets and demand their rights? For a citizen, there are better protections as compared to an immigrant, where the fear comes into play. That's number two. And the last one is, we're talking about like possibilities for alternatives. And there are possibilities. There are platform cooperatives. We don't hear much about them because they may not be as big as some of these multinational platforms. We often think of platforms within the context of platform capitalism, but there is that other side of the picture that some scholars do write about and call it platform socialism. Is it possible to envision a platform economy where workers have more of a say in governing the platforms that they work for, or in creating the platforms that they work for? These examples do exist. There are big conferences that take place on platform cooperativism as well. And these are issues, these are like, Dr. Nagla did bring up the issue of like local startups. Some of these are local startups, and they are certainly more collaborative in discussing how can we make this work a better environment, a better experience for our workers. Not all, but they are out there, and it's our responsibility and duty to basically highlight these and underline them when we talk, when we write, etc.
Thank you so much, Dr. Oguz, for these insights. And you highlighted a very important point, which is that, I mean, gig workers and platform workers are not a cohesive group, and they do intersect with so many other forms of vulnerability, including on top of them being migrants and being refugees. Indeed, not speaking the same language, being elderly often, being child labor. I mean, also they can intersect with so many forms of vulnerability, with disability, with women, and so on and so forth. And I mean, here I'd like to reemphasize, I mean, the importance of also tapping into the offline gig economy, because I mean, online gig economy has become more, has been proliferating at a very fast pace, and that's why we are going in this direction. But also, if we are to think about the offline gig economy, I mean, in Lebanon, we're seeing those like shawish or patrons that are making cleaners, groups of cleaners work, and they are earning their wages, and they aren't providing them with any forms of social protection or protection at all. And at the same time, they are working in very precarious conditions, in very bad working conditions, and they aren't provided with any sort of health insurance, even from work-related injuries. So this is a very risky field that we need to keep visiting, I mean, until some those pragmatic solutions that we are trying to advance make it, I mean, somewhere. Ola, please feel free to come in, and then we're going to turn it to Radwa.
Thank you, Farah. Thank you, organizers and the speakers. This is very interesting. This is a new topic to me, so I really enjoyed listening to the different aspects. I have two short questions coming from a pragmatic point of view. During crisis, during COVID, and especially during the multifaceted crisis in Lebanon, a lot of highly educated people were laid off, or they lost their jobs from institutions, from companies, from big corporations, etc. So many of them went to gig or to freelancing or whatever we would call it, and they become vulnerable. So vulnerable to social protection and to all the challenges that you raised today. So is it good or bad for such people to go to gig, or do they have to keep searching for companies and institutions to hire them in the classic way? The other question is that it is related to health coverage, because in countries, Lebanon, for example, before the crisis, at least, it was based, the health coverage was based on private sector providers and private insurance companies, and they always seek, or there's a challenge in the continuation of health coverage programs if you're moving between jobs. So if there's some sort of health coverage for gig work, it will be short term, per day, per week, I don't know. So how can we figure out a social protection scheme that will help these people? Because as you said, Farah, they cannot pay the bulk of their income on private insurance. So how can we make sure that when they finish their job or task, they can still have some kind of longer term, if not to say a one-year program, at least to have some kind of continuation in health coverage? Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm going to let Wassim and Oguz answer your question, Ola. But first, let's take a question or Radwa's question or comment, and probably a couple of other questions before they do so. Radwa, please feel free to come in.
Yes,
Radwa,
thank you.
Yes. How are you? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for this webinar. It really helps a lot, and in understanding the next situation, how can we really work on the social protection for workers. But I was wondering, what about if those people themselves or the workers are seeking maybe financially, maybe they want their salaries to be higher compared to social protection. They don't care about the future. They only care about the short run, especially with all of these vulnerability and the challenges in the economic situation. If I'm talking about Egypt, so they won't raise in their salaries compared to other benefits. How can we make sort of balance between what providing them with a safety in the long run, but at the same time, maybe minimum wage or decent wage for them, and this maybe also affect the owners at the end of the day, because they always suffer from a high rate of turnover. I think this is because of their work conditions. If they are provided with decent work conditions, these youth will remain more and pay back for the startups instead of keep searching for better offers. And thank you so much. I don't want to take much time. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Radwa. Yeah, and I mean, you raised a very important point, which is that people, given economic hardships and the economic crises and financial crisis prevailing in different Arab contexts and in different parts of the world, I mean, people are busy putting bread on the table and making a living, and they are busy with the day-to-day stuff, such as electricity cuts, power cuts, water cuts, and so on and so forth, that they feel just not necessarily comfortable, but that they think that they are comfortable where they are doing what they are doing. And again, they don't want to be formalized because they don't want to pay taxes, but at the same time, they need social protection. And here, this takes us back to the point that universal social protection, a horizontal social protection floor for all across that provides core life cycle coverage is key. because those will, because it includes non-contributory social protection schemes that would cover those that cannot afford to contribute, that cannot afford to also pay taxes, but also they offer them non-contributory social protection that is tax financed through the taxes of the state and not necessarily from their own contributions. I saw Oguz wanted to come in, and then Wassim, if I'm not wrong. So please feel free, you guys.
Yeah, I think I'm just gonna like provide a general answer to all three questions rather than go all one by one. I mean, this is what we have seen during COVID, that a lot of people did lose jobs, and then a lot, like, we had this new category of essential workers that just came out of nowhere, like as if like not all workers are essential in some capacity, but we had those that are delivering food, that are working in supermarkets, healthcare sector, etc. So, and of course, around this time, we also had a lot of new platforms come in to fill in this gap. That's the reason why, like at a time, I mean, that's platforms do provide jobs. That's not something that we're saying they don't. The thing is, the jobs that they provide come with a lot of baggage attached. One of them being that a lot of workers end up being easily discardable. What we have seen during the height of COVID was platforms competing for workers in Germany. I remember on billboards, platforms competing with each other next to each other, like, saying, I'm going to give 100, no, I'm going to give 150 as a sign-up bonus. So that was the case back in 2021. And then a year later, what happened was some of the platforms exited the market. Some of them went bankrupt. Some of them got taken over. And a lot of the workers got shuffled around. Some of them lost their jobs because they did not necessarily have benefits per se. Many of them were within the 6 months probation period. So they were easily making it even easier for them to be discardable. Also, as I mentioned, many of them are immigrants and they're on short-term visas. So that's something that also platforms make use of. I'm not saying it's a bad deal, like they get to work, they get to make some pocket money, but for all the reasons that I've stated before, this is precarious work and that has to be taken into account. So within the context of health coverage, I am all for it. I think everyone should have universal health coverage. Everyone should be insured at some capacity, workers or not workers, does not matter. Of course, it should be also the platform's responsibility as a work provider to provide these benefits. It should not just be the state. The state should also, the state should regulate that platforms do live up to these standards. There are different schemes in place. Some of them do provide 100%, some of them provide less, some of them provide only accidents or commercial insurance, others provide the full healthcare package. There are different, and these are all things that we take into account as we think about what it means to provide fair working conditions. That was principle 2.2 for us, if there's a safety net in place, and what does that safety net entail? I think that's it. I hope I answered most of the questions that was raised. If something is missing, just do let me know.
No, you did, dear. You did. Thank you so much. And after Wassim comes in, please feel free to add any point that you might have forgotten. Wassim?
Thanks. I won't take long. Just wanted to offer my reflections on the points raised by Rana and Wada. Basically, it's not about good or bad for workers to join the platform economy during the crisis. I'd like to look at this as not an either or, but something beyond. The problems arise particularly when, let's first remember that informal labor exists everywhere, and the platform economy, while not necessarily informal labor, is a form of precarious work, and it's particularly difficult for the state to control the labor conditions in all forms of work. The alternative to traditional employment during times of crisis, which is the platform economy, slowly morphs into a parallel labor market in which the worker becomes invisible to the state, particularly because the workers are misclassified as independent workers rather than employees, because as we've established, they do perform the functions of employees. The implications of this are large at the social contract level, because now you have a significant portion of the labor force who no longer want to move to traditional employment and want to stay this platform economy where they basically have no social provisions whatsoever. So this is what we mean when the root problems of the platform economy are not addressed. These will slowly carry large implications that go beyond the temporary crisis, hopefully a temporary crisis that we're facing in the case of Lebanon. I hope this offers some nuance.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it also points on the fact that, I mean, being fully informal gives people a lot of room to circumvent rules and regulations and to make a living. And being formal makes them also somehow better off. But being again in this gray zone that we talked about earlier, as you said, Wassim, makes them, I mean, they're neither fully informal and neither nor fully formal, and this makes them, I mean, bound to their employers. I don't know, to their employers' violations, abuse, all while being classified as informal and not as being employed. So I think this is very important. And for me, I mean, the key takeaway out of all of this discussion is that we need to regulate to protect, but we also need to protect from regulations. And we do need to strike this balance. And at the same time, we need to think of the offline gig workers leaning more towards the informal side. And when we speak about the online gig workers or the platform workers, we need to think about the role of the private sector. And here comes the issue of corporate social responsibility more broadly. I mean, even if even before the gig economy has become more digitalized, we have been having issues with the private sector not abiding by corporate social responsibility principles. So now with the platform economy, this has even accentuated the situation and made it worse. I can see, oh no, this is a private message. I'm not sure if anybody else has a question or a comment, or else we could just, I mean, close the discussion and let me see first if anybody has anything to add before we end our discussion. All right, then I would like, on behalf of the TPI team, the Policy Initiatives team, and on behalf of the Arab Reform Initiative and the Arab Region Hub for Social Protection, to thank you all for joining this webinar discussion, for participating with us. I'd like to thank the speakers for their very insightful presentations and for their research work. I mean, being the hidden soldiers, doing all of this very much needed research and producing the much needed knowledge in our context and all over the globe. I hope that you found this discussion fruitful, and I mean, this webinar discussion will be was recorded, as you all have realized, and it will be published later on. I hope it will bounce back to many other discussions and synergies on the topic, and that there will be a lot of like ensuing policy recommendations that could be consolidated through these research outputs and hopefully also advanced amongst, I mean, the policymakers, so that we can make the positive change that we all aspire for. Thank you all. Thank you, TPI, for this opportunity and for hosting this webinar. Many thanks. See you, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
Farah. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Wassim. Thank you, Oguz. Bye.